hi, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are coming from, zooming in from. My name is Janice, and I am one of the employees here at the Los Angeles Center of Photography. So welcome you all. And it's a huge honor that we have Laurent Chevalier as our guest presenter this evening. Now, Laurent was actually one of our speakers last year for our Say What You Want to Say exhibition. So we're super excited to have him back. So thank you, Laurent, for joining us. A little bit about Laurent. So he was actually born in Los Angeles, then grew up, West Side, and then grew up in Seattle, and now is living and working in New York City as an attorney. But we're not going to talk about that tonight. We're going to really talk about his street photography and just general photography as well. So, Laurent, I'm reading your bio, and you say that you utilize photography to shift the framework of representative imagery using processes and media from the past. Laurent archives for the future while simultaneously engaging contemporary social issues and promoting social justice. So we're going to see some of his work tonight. Laurent, how are you?
I am good. Thank you for that intro. I appreciate
Take
it.
it away,
I'm doing
sir.
well though.
The floor
All
is yours.
right. Well, the thank you for the intro and for reading that portion of that bio. That bio basically means I shoot film and I take pictures of my community. If you were to put it into one sentence, I'd just like to make it sound nice for the internet. But yeah, so my name is Laurent Chevalier. I am an attorney by day trade. That's what pays the rest of my bills. But photography is my heart and practice. And my intro into photography was actually a history class when I was in college. I'm not formally trained, so I'm self-taught as far as my artistic practice. And so I kind of want to talk tonight about the process and I guess focus and through lines of developing my craft and my practice over time and how I've culminated that into two separate bodies of work that sort of led into each other. So I will start a share. I'm going to show you just a couple images. This man this is my grandfather, who unfortunately passed recently, but he actually was a photographer in Chicago for many, many years. And before I even started on my own photographic journey, I didn't realize he had already been working in this thing. And so he was a great turning point for me because once he saw that I was working on my practice and he saw that I was serious about it and he saw that I had a love for the analog process, he actually said, hey, come on out to Chicago, hang out for a weekend, we'll listen to some Miles Davis records, and I'm going to give you a bunch of stuff and we're going to talk about what it takes to really be a photographer. So I wanted to start off by sending a shout out to him because he was very instrumental in the process. Now, I've recently published a book entitled Enough, but before we get to that, I wanted to show you sort of my process and how it developed over time. So as I mentioned, I am self-taught. And so basically what it started with was I took that history of photography class in college. This was the early 2000s. And it was just a formal history class, taking me all through from the invention of photography to various characters and influential artists. But it was not a practice class. It was not, going into the dark room, shooting anything. But interesting enough, at the end of that class, the teacher had a process where she said she wanted everyone to go out and make a series. And so when I look back, that's actually a rather unique way to take a history class. You don't often take like a impressionist painting class of history and they say, yeah, okay, at the end now we want you to make an impressionist painting. But I'm forever grateful to that teacher because that ended up sort of starting me on my journey. So I went to shoot my photo essay, and it was my first time intentionally taking photos for the purpose of creating images, not just capturing my family at a gathering or Thanksgiving or something like that. And so that was my first intro. But beyond that, I didn't take any other formal classes. I got my own little camera, I think off of like a thrift store or something like that. I started taking pictures and I started to, get them back and wonder why they look terrible. And it was a combination of me not knowing what I was doing, and also I had a very bad lens, and I had no idea that it even was a bad lens. But as I kept going, my process was basically I would just keep the camera on me at all times. I just would have it and it would shoot whatever my circumstance was. So a lot of times it was just friends. Sometimes somebody would ask for a picture, you take a picture, you go to a concert, you go to the park. So it was very happenstance. But what I want to show you was this is a photo from some of those earlier days. And, substantively, formally, it is not a photo that moves me uh, as I would hope it would move, someone when I'm showing photos of my current work. But what I realized is that the process for me, particularly being self-taught, was it took me taking a lot of photos and then going back into those photos and realizing, even though imperfectly executed, the nuggets of observation that I found myself making. So this was one that sort of has an element that ends up being a through line to a later body of work. And this was another. I moved to Brooklyn in 2007, so these are still photos from early on into my practice. And once again, this is something where, as I look at this photo, I don't think it's expertly executed or that sort of thing. But as I look back on it with my eyes now, I see that there was a nugget of my perspective starting to show through. And what I realized I needed to do was it took me looking through a lot of my photos over a longer period of time because my eye was not trained in order to train my eye and discover myself. Kind of harkening back to Miles Davis again is, he said, it takes a long time of playing before you sound like yourself. And this is another one from those very early days where, the framing is so at best. The exposure is all over the place. But as I looked back and looked through those images, I realized that there was a certain perspective I was starting to observe within myself. And I think that's probably one of the more important things in developing my practice, particularly for, quote unquote street photography. I've kind of taken to calling it observational artistry because I think that sometimes when people speak about street photography, they tend to lock themselves in and think that it has to be done in certain spaces, in certain ways. But I think it's really more of an ethos that can kind of carry itself through various practices and sort of things. So early on, my influences, as far as people I start to look into their books, look into their work, were Henri Cartier-Bresson. His idea of the decisive moment was very informative for me and determinative of how I decided I wanted to look at the world. Robert Frank's The Americans was huge, and then as well as Gary Winogrand, and those people who took that sort of approach to the street. So what I realized I'd like to do was I'm very much an observational sort of quiet, blending in sort of person, and I found that you need to take your best attribute and bring it to whatever space you're attempting to photograph. I was not the Bruce Gilden guy that's going to flash the camera in someone's face and tell them to hit the hay if they had a problem with it. But what I really liked and what I really found myself fascinated by was the idea that you can learn from a lot of spaces in which you find yourself. So even with those early photos that I showed you, even though substantively they weren't there, I realized that I like the idea of bringing in the information I was surrounded by and also the circumstances that I naturally found myself and finding the moments that could be shared and could be, you know, showing beauty and experience for other people in those moments. So as I started to compile work and as I started to look back at my own work and start to realize where my eyes were drawn, in my inspiration by Robert Frank's The Americans, I wanted to make a project that was a tribute to New York. So I created this project, which was called The New Yorkers. And it really meant to, similarly to Robert Frank, sort of represent a cross section of various perspectives in the city, various experiences in the city, and not necessarily be exhaustive, but have a chance to really be able to show as wide of a breadth as I could with that work. And so in that, I knew I wanted to work quietly. I wanted to work in a way that was inobtrusive as possible because I thought that the most unique and important thing for me was being able to share a moment that had not yet really been tainted by my presence with the camera. Because we all know that a camera, in and of itself, once it's realized, it changes the environment that you're in. It changes the dynamic of the people that are experiencing and interacting with that camera. There's always a give and there's always a take. I mean, even the phrasing that we use, we take photos because we're capturing a moment, we're pulling from that scene. And so I wanted to limit the effect of that as much as possible. And so with that, I started just going through the city. And these were created on my way to barbecues, on my way to work. And it was born out of myself just keeping my camera with me at all times. And so I felt I felt good about some of the perspectives that were coming through in this. And I started to realize that this was a manner in which I enjoyed working and that I felt that was informative not only to myself, but also to hopefully to people who would receive this work. And so these were a collection of images. They were shot over probably about a year and a half, maybe 2 years, just throughout all locations of New York City's 5 boroughs that I would find myself. And so this was born out of creating images and not necessarily shooting to create this project, but actually rather learning from the archive that I was starting to amass by going back and finding the connections and the stories that I really wanted to communicate. And by the way, I'm much more of a conversational than a lecture person. So if someone has a question that they feel very, 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 very confident in wanting to discuss, throw it in there because I'm always up for that. But that is what this project was born out of. And so, with the time that it took, now I guess just to go back, this project was really created after I'd been shooting seriously for probably 4 to 5 years. And so I think because there's sort of a double-edged sword, because I was not formally taught, I had to learn a lot of things sort of the hard way. And it took a lot of trial, a lot of error to go through because I was also learning the analog craft. All of these were shot on film, as well as learning the substantive image craft. But what I think it did allow me to do, while albeit taking longer, was to really find an avenue to determine my perspective and my voice because I wasn't absorbing as much external work previously before I started making my own, and I think that helped me be able to hone in on my own idea and my own spirit that I wanted to, investigate and accomplish. And so as I went through and I created this work, I realized that there were certain stories that were drawing me closer and that were moving me more within even this body of work. And so after I'd completed this, and as I was looking through, the images and the body of work that was part of this, I realized that I wanted to take the perspective that I had, and now through my own study and through my own research, I started to have a better understanding and knowledge of the photographers that came before me, the bodies of work that were created, the canon of photography, particularly within the idea of street photography, that I was sort of stepping into and attempting to place myself in the lineup. And so as I did that, I realized that what I found to be important for the next project was to take the idea and the spirit of sort of, classic street photography, the Joel Merowitzes, the Gary Winograms, the Robert Franks, and to point it on my own community, specifically in New York, the Black community and the Black experience within New York, from that lens of observational artistry without being as much of a visitor to those spaces. Because I realized looking back that number one, there were not a ton of stories that were done on specifically Black experiences, and if they were often were not given the opportunity to be highlighted by people who lived in that community. So with that, I started working on my next project, which is entitled Enough. All right, so this project was born. It was born out of, as I mentioned, that desire to the desire to document and the desire to also voice perspective. I felt that not that my voice was the one that needed to be heard, but that more voices needed to be heard, and mine should be one that could be considered among that sort of historical canon. There's such amazing and powerful work from the civil rights era and such, but there's often not the same. There's not the same degree of highlight and degree of historical um, placing, I guess, if you will, of the Black photographers who were documenting those same works. And so I thought it was important in this time, in a time that feels often so parallel to the civil rights era, the 60s, late early 70s, um, to document and create a story that reflected my perspective on it and reflected what I felt was a more nuanced approach to the visualization of the Black community. And so that was where this um, project was born out of. But it really, image wise, came out of the same process that I had established even in creating the New Yorkers project. And that was creating work, allowing my mind to be free, allowing my camera to capture wherever I found myself wanting to place it and not placing myself within great constraints. Um, but then to go back and sort of cull through that to find what are the stories that are moving me and what are the things that maybe I didn't realize I found myself drawn to repeatedly. And so once I decided that I wanted to make a book about the Black experience in New York City from the observation of street photography, of candid documentary style, non-posed, very inobtrusive as much as possible. I then realized that I also could not use that as my only guideline or post in determining what the story was of this image. And so the first part was compiling what images could conceivably be involved. And so the first thing was I actually printed out a box of about 700 4x6s. And I started to go through those and say, okay, what are the images that seem to repeat? What are the motifs that seem to repeat? What are things that sort of manifest themselves over and over again? And of those things, what are the things that I find important? And what are the things that I think could be told in different ways continuously? So I realized I had sort of three very key turning points or key sections of thought that manifested repeatedly and that I thought were important to be able to weave together. And that was the idea of patriotism or country, the relationship between Black people and their country, and the historical implications of that. Um, the idea of community and space is something that was throughout everything, but it's kind of almost like a ghost subtext, if you will, because it really touches on everything. Spirituality and religion was another thing that I found repeatedly showed itself and I thought would be an important section to always highlight. And the other was authority or policing was another that revealed itself sort of repeatedly and over time. And so as I went through those and I determined that those were the stories that I wanted to make sure were told throughout the course of the book, my next step was then going through and saying, okay, well, how do I want to approach each of these stories in sections? Because I've always found that there's different ways to look at the same thing or similar, subject matter. And so I ended up creating four different sections in the book that all relate to those three themes of patriotism, of police, of family, of religion, four themes rather, but then approach them from different ways. And so what you notice is that um, there's vehicles throughout the course of the book, and there's three specific vehicles that sort of serve as turning points in each chapter. And so in the very beginning, there was a white caprice that started it off, and that was the first section. And that was really about establishing the the breadth and the space of the fullness of the experience of weaving together religion, of weaving together patriotism, of weaving together family, of weaving together police into the full experience, and having that show good relationships with those things and negative relationships with those things. And then once I put the images together, I knew that I wanted the images to have another aspect of being able to speak to the viewer. And so because I had spent more time researching and connecting with prior artists, I was able to expand my knowledge of what I was able to be inspired by. And so the whole book itself is actually very inspired by Roy de Carava's and Langston Hughes' book called The Sweet Flypaper of Life, in which Roy de Carava created a chronicling of images throughout Harlem. And Langston Hughes created this poem that ran through the course of those images. And I've always felt that poetry and photography are very they're sort of counterparts of each other in many ways. I think photography is sort of the poetry of seeing, if you will, in that, we all often look at things, but a photograph can make you look at the same thing a little bit differently. And similarly, poetry can make you think about the words that you use and receive in a different way than the words that are thrown about throughout your daily walk. And so I was able to work with a really wonderful poet who's a friend of mine named Dr. Jamila Liscott. And she created poetry based off of that first stack of images I showed you, because what I wanted to make sure I had was I never wanted it to be a one-to-one relationship of poem to image. I wanted there to be a wider relationship of the poetry as a whole and the poetry of the images as a whole, because I think that that's more representative of what it is to have the Black experience in New York and in the US, because I think that people often find themselves pointing to very specific elements of the experience and using it to try and identify the whole thing. You may have heard people say, Blackness is not a monolith. And so I'm trying to find small ways to create an expanse of that experience and not limit it, was something I wanted to do with this project. And then because I'm still coming at it from a very specifically photographic point of view, I wanted to make sure that the photos themselves had their own story and had their own rhythm and had their own flow and had a place that they started and a place that they ended. So I actually created the sequence of the book photographically without the poetry, because I wanted to make sure that that was established. And then I weaved in the poetry that Dr. Liska provided me into the narrative of the book, so that they enhanced and they counteracted each other rather than sort of defining one another. And I mentioned earlier that the cars were a turning point. So this is actually another vehicle that sort of serves as a turning point into another section of the book where I wanted to explore sort of the complicated relationship between Blackness and spirituality, because in many ways, Christianity, spirituality has buoyed and sustained Black people throughout, the course of this country. But then there's also a lot of predatory elements that can arise out of that as well. People sometimes take that perspective, they take that position, and they wield it against those who are relying on it. And so that's what I wanted to use this particular section for, to kind of show a little bit of that complicated relationship toward religion, toward spirituality, and toward the notion of the neighborhood and how we rely on that to sustain ourselves. And so, in making the images themselves, I basically never set out, left my house and said, I'm going to go make images for this project. It really was more of, I always wanted this book and this project to make itself more of a revelation of what was already there. And so these are all moments in which I already naturally found myself. I never traveled to make these images. I didn't even, take the train to a particular neighborhood in order to, find a particular subject or anything like that. These are all things that, if one was to shadow me in my life, things that they would be exposed to and see and potentially experience. Because I thought that it was very important to give an opportunity to highlight um, the natural experience of what it is to live as a Black person. And specifically, this is New York City, an urban experience, but I wanted I wanted it to be able to stand in for a wider aspect of that experience, because like I mentioned, there's a lot of polarization in those views. Some people think of it as this great burden and this great trial, but there's so much beauty and there's so much joy in living in these neighborhoods and traveling around the people that live in the neighborhoods and going to these restaurants and seeing these kids and seeing people playing dominoes, outside of a little store. And so it's a lot, it's a wider spread of experience than just, black or white, no pun intended. And this is the second to last vehicle that serves as a turning point in the book. And this section particularly is meant to focus subtly, but more pointedly on the struggle elements of navigating these spaces and navigating, the systems that we're all finding ourselves in. Because I wanted this project to have a truth, and that it didn't shy away from the good or the bad, but it showed more of the truth of the experience throughout all aspects. And so one of the things that was interesting about creating this was finding those through lines, like I mentioned, finding those connections. If you remember, one of the earlier images I showed you was the man with the Yankee hat leaning up against the pole, and there's a box in front of him that says fragile. And of course, he's just standing there. It doesn't, he's not thinking about that. But an image like that was something that um, had the nugget of thought about the experience of, say, Black manhood, that would lead to me being able to consider these two images, who were shot on very different times, in very different circumstances, and linking them together and thinking about the relationship and the passage of time between one subject of the photo and the other. And the other thing is, because I was moving very quietly and unobtrusively, generally I don't have many images where the subject is actually directly engaging with me. I watched some old Gary Winogrand videos and tried to pick up some of his tricks and tips of how to move through without really being picked up or realize that you're taking a photo. But I thought that those two were a moment to be able to show the relationship with the viewer, as well as with the people that are being viewed through the lens of the observer. And so I hope that you can see that with this project, the approach visually and the style has changed to some degree from those first early pictures. But what I learned is that um, you have your perspective often long before you know exactly how to accomplish communicating it. And so I think with time, what I was able to get better at and learn was how to hone in and use craft and technique in order to accomplish the presentation of my perspective. Also, this image, this is the last vehicle in the turning points of vehicles in the chapter. And this is the only vehicle that's black. It's the only vehicle that sort of has a little more, a little more pizzazz to it. And so this image serves as the turning point toward what I consider to be sort of a space of forward-looking and hope toward a growth and betterment. But what I wanted to make sure I did with this image or with this series in total was create enough space in the images so that whatever perspective you had when you come to them, you will find reinforced in the images themselves, because I think that's what's true about street photography in general, and what's true about the human experience in general, is that if you are of a mind to see things a certain way, whether negatively, positively, or somewhere in between, what you look at will ultimately reinforce that. And so I wanted the book to kind of create a space for that, specifically with regard to the Black experience. In that if you are looking for struggle, you will find struggle in these images to reinforce that perspective. But if you are of the perspective that you are seeing joy and you're seeing hope and you're seeing opportunities for betterment and community, that you will find that as well. And so there was one poem that Jamila wrote that said, "They break our bones." And so that poem, this book actually came out last year, and it came out just before the killing of George Floyd. And so that poem ended up floating around the internet because people felt that it resonated very much with the times that we were in, specifically then. But what I hope is that there's an opportunity for the other aspects of this book to resonate as well, to where things maybe are not in the same space that they are and that they have been for a long time, but that the truth of both of those experiences is validated throughout the process of this whole observation of myself, looking at the environment and at the community, but also of the individuals who are able to receive and look at this work itself, that they can find the different avenues and that we can find the places where we need to grow and be better. But the truth is there for both sides. So this is the last image in the book. And I had started with a child and I ended with a child in the book because that's how we all start. And I think that's where the future is really holding for moving forward, is in the children and in the youth, and what we leave them and what we give them as we move forward. So that is enough. That is me, no pun intended. Hopefully you guys have some questions or some points to chat about, and I'm glad to talk to anybody who's got something.
All right. Thank you so much for that beautiful presentation. Um, does anyone have any questions? Feel free to type them in the chat, or you're more than welcome to pipe up now and say, I've got a question.
Yeah, come talk to me.
Come and talk to us. Lauren, I'm going to start off. There seems to be a theme this week about bravery. A lot of the street photographers have talked about overcoming fear of shooting on the street. Is that something that you relate to, or what's your process going on the street and overcoming certain fears of shooting people and whatnot?
Yeah, I think it's always something I'm mindful of. It's never, I don't think it's anything that ever completely goes away and that you just forget about. I think you find better ways to navigate it. And, sometimes that's more confidence in yourself and knowing what you want to do and knowing the value of it. And that helps lend a great that helps lend a lot toward being able to navigate that space. You know, I think when you start out, it's more figuring out how to not be caught or something like that as you do it. But as you move forward, you get better about understanding what it is you're doing and the purpose of it. And then also, I think people can read the energy that you give off probably more than you realize. So I think if you're lurking around and you don't have great intentions, then it's going to be a lot more difficult for you to be able to accomplish what you want to accomplish because people will be able to pick up on that. You know, I've had a lot of moments where I've been in maybe a more in what would seem to be an intimate space, and I've taken the photo and I've ended up interacting with the person, even just briefly, but it's in passing and it's all good because they recognize that I'm not coming at it from a place of being lecherous or trying to sneak and grab something. It's just like, hey, I acknowledge what you're here doing, and you've obviously acknowledged me and the value that I presented to you as a subject. And so now we can move on and continue going that way. So I think the bravery comes, I mean, part of it's experience, part of it's comfort, but I think a lot of it is knowledge and confidence in what you're doing.
Okay, great. Laura has a question. She says, I wonder, as your website states your books are sold out, do you think about reprinting a second edition?
I've thought about it. I'm not sure. Maybe, but I'm not sure, honestly. I don't know. We'll see. We'll see. I might. I might.
Okay. You don't have any sneaky copies lying around that if we wanted to purchase, we could.
Not no. I think he got them all. I have my little like hold on for the my stash, but
Yeah.
that's it.
All right. Good, good. Does anyone else have any questions? All right. Well,
I think I have one.
oh,
I
Kevin Weinstein, take it away.
I wrote a bunch of notes only because I get nervous when I talk. So now you know why I'm reading notes, okay? But you mentioned in your early work, you had glimpses, into what you see now today as your own voice, right? And but also how you see and interpret everything around you. And that shooting film, while it's a massive struggle, I totally get it. I started 35 years ago. I was forced into film. Um, but all those trials and errors and you found those errors like their weight was worth gold, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, the inability to kind of see what you're doing now, correcting it in a computer. What were some of those nuggets? Because I have a photo too. I have a photo that when I do a talk, I often lead off with this photo, and it's a nature photo. I don't shoot nature photos, but that photo to me has about 5 different things in it that are so important to me now because I see that I was already seeing that way then and I didn't know it, and now it's definitely a part of almost every picture I make today. So what were some of those nuggets that when you went back to your early work that you found were part of your voice as you moved along with photography? Because I think that talking about your own personal voice and developing it is so important because most people want, you know, join a street photography workshop because they want the tips and tricks on how to get fast, how to make those
Mm-hmm.
images that are going to get the 1,000 likes. And I got to get a Bruce Gilden flash in people want that stuff. Nobody really wants to spend time on the most important part of photography, which is your voice. Because Laurent,
Mm-hmm.
you're going to interpret the same thing that I see in a very, very different way than I will. So, what were some of those nuggets that you now see today?
So I think one thing that I've somewhat recently realized I um, look to and I find a lot is a sense of duality. And I find that I'm very enamored by that idea and the idea of there being sort of two extremes and most of the really relevant information and the things that you can learn from being the space between those two. And so, for instance, in this project, I kind of vacillated between, you know, moments where I really found beauty and reverence and say, a religious figure or something like that, and then moments that I at least internally interpret as, a difficulty or a question, and then feeling that the images that were in between really kind of filled out the truth of that experience. So that's one thing that I think I realized with time, going back. And then also, I realized that there's a certain freedom and truthfulness in how, children and youth navigate these spaces versus how, adults are navigating these spaces. And so that's something I realized I kind of find myself looking to is, finding, an adult in a space and finding a child navigating the same space, and the difference of that experience and the difference of their perspective on it. And so those are things that I realized were in there early, but I didn't always know how to get to. And then I also think that there was a point where early on, that was sort of purer in my photos, even if it wasn't always captured perfectly. And then there was a point where I learned enough to start trying to create images like the people I had learned about. And so things got a little bit muddied as far as my voice, but my technique got better. And now I think I'm at a better point where I can try and go back to the purity of my perspective with a greater technique of how to communicate that purity. So I think those are some of the things that kind of came through early that I've learned looking back.
Do you ever look at your earlier work and find certain ways of seeing in terms of compositional elements, quality of light, things that, I mean, listen, you're standing there with a camera, you have 360 degrees around you, and you chose this tiny little thing. Are there clues and hints from your early shooting that was just so organic? You didn't really know what you were doing. Do you see compositional, like the birth of your compositional kind of way of seeing and your habits back then as well too?
I think some. I think some. And it's funny because I'm often very, at least when I'm shooting, I'm often not thinking a ton about composition. I know where my frame, I've learned my camera, I know where my frame is going to be. And I'm, in a general sense, trying to frame it within that. But I'm often not thinking quite as much about how all those pieces fall together immediately. But then, like you said, I'll look back and realize there might be a little bit of a consistency in how, I guess, that moment that I decided to hit the shutter comes together. So a lot of times there ends up being some movement, sort of mid frame or going toward the edge of the frame. And then I like I, I like an opportunity for a lot of things to kind of be seen in the space, I think, when I can. So, I like finding a key moment and then realizing there's a lot of little things going on in the background. So, the thing that might catch my eye is a child moving into a gate. But then what I didn't realize is that there's someone else on the top, and there's a window open, and then there's a basketball rolling off to the side. And I didn't think about it consciously, but those sort of things pop up more consistently. So I realize is a part of my way of seeing, even if I'm not, saying this is it when I hit the shutter.
Interesting. Thank you so much for that.
We have a couple of other questions.
Oh, nice.
Mike and Veronica Lynch. I think it's Mike Lynch. Hi, Mike. Can you talk about your editing down from 700 and your pairing process?
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing for the editing down for me was starting to see them together. And that was where the sections, even if the book started to manifest, was really saying, I just started to lay them all out and then look, part of it was looking, saying, all right, now that this printed, does this look good at all? And, you chuck a few of those. But a lot of it was seeing, what does this tie to thematically? And I started really, first I just started to group those together. So basically anything that had something to do with patriotism or America or the relationship to country, I started to put those together. And then from that, I could see which ones maybe started to say different things, which ones started to say the same thing, and realize, okay, is this saying the same thing in a different way, or is it saying something completely different? And what's the value in including this in that project? And then part of it was, sometimes it was composition that would highlight each other. I had two images of people going upstairs from completely different times, completely different walks. But I realized, oh, this is an older man and an older woman in individual images. These should go together because, you might forget that they could be connected if I put too much space between them. But then sometimes I wanted something that had a little bit more contrast between two images. So maybe see if I can think of an example that makes sense on this one. Actually, an example would be some things that manifested a few times early was park fencing. I realized I shot through and into like fencing at sports parks and that sort of thing. And I started to think about, okay, what can I do with that would make sense visually? And so as I started to put those together, I realized I had varying vantage points and I could make it look like we were sort of moving through a park. Let's see, actually, just share this real quick just so you can see. Can you guys see that? That come through? Okay. So yeah, I have the first one on the left, very close to the fence, the kid looking at me. And then what I imagined was in the image on the right, maybe that's the kid looking through at the person that's laying down there. And then you come to the next one, and behind the car is that same kind of fence. So it was kind of moving through and away from this fence. So part of it would be, things like that, compositionally. But then the other, I think, aspect of the edit for me was, I love jazz, and I think of street photography in a very sort of jazz way, in that, sometimes you need rhythm, but sometimes you need to kind of breathe and flow. And so if I had images that seemed to kind of have more weight, then I'd want to kind of create a flow into something that was a little bit lighter or a little bit different in perspective, and then creating a rhythm throughout the whole thing with that. So a combination of composition, specific subject matter, and then also weight was how I really started to edit down and then edit together.
Okay. Great. And Laura Jean has a question. Do you ever think about getting model releases? She lives in Europe and is not sure if they're necessary there. One contest she entered was not accepted because she didn't have an official model release, and she wants to know, in terms of your book and dealing with a publisher, is that required?
So for mine, no, we didn't have to go through any model releases because these were all public spaces, and they were not being used for any advertising or anything like that. It was all sort of an artistic expression, and so for our purposes, we were okay with that. If I were doing more official portraits and sitting with someone, I certainly would, and I have done that. But in the realm where I was sort of just moving through public spaces, navigating those open spaces, and then creating this just for the purpose of artistic representation and presentation, then no, I didn't go through any model release process or anything like that.
Yeah, that's an interesting question because it does vary from country to country as well. I think Australia, where I'm from, has a different policy on that and whatnot. So
yeah, because I know for us, it's if you're using it for some sort of advertisement or you're trying to sell something with it, then you will need a release because you're using their likeness for it. But if you're using it, if they're in a public space and you're not like shooting into someone's home or something like that, and you're just doing it for artistic representation, then you're perfectly fine.
The cover of a book, at least in the United States, actually does fall under advertising. So definitely you're going to want to look at your own country for sure. I know France, people in France, you actually own your likeness when you're out on the public street. Thus, actually, street photography is technically illegal in Paris. And I know Bruce Gilden did a book in Paris, and he had two assistants with him, and every time he photographed somebody, an assistant would go off and actually get a model release.
That had to be the hard part of that job.
Yeah, that would have not been.
You always want to check your own country. I mean, if you're from the US and you're applying to something in Europe, I mean, honestly, I've never heard anybody in a contest that needs a model release up front. But maybe they wanted that because, of course, they're going to turn around and use your images then for advertising.
Yeah.
Right.
Workshop.
I likely imagine that's what it could be.
Yeah. All right. I think this one will be our last question. And this comes from Richard. Hi, Richard. What might be the most valuable, memorable experience you had while making the book?
That's a good question. You know what? I think personally, probably the most valuable, I would say probably one of the most valuable experiences in making the book was, so I compiled the images, I made my sequence, I worked with my friend who was the poet, we worked together, and we had a lot of discussions on what we envisioned the book communicating and doing and accomplishing. So she and I were on a great, the same page. And so she created the poetry and I weaved the poetry together. But I think one of the great things was I sent all of that to another friend of mine who's a writer and asked him if he would write the intro essay for it. And I didn't really talk to him a lot about what I felt the book was about and what I wanted it to do. I just wanted him to write an intro because I trusted his voice and just see where he would take it. And so when he sent me back the essay, he basically expounded in a way that I couldn't because he's a writer and I am not in his ilk. Exactly the things and the thoughts and the conversations that she and I were having. And he put that into that essay form, which really validated for me that what I intended to communicate was communicated and that the work that I hoped to accomplish, at least in that small moment, was accomplished. And so I think that was probably one of the most validating and rewarding and memorable points to know that, the work I put in, because, this was shot over like 5 years, the work that was put in went where I wanted it to go. And it seems to still be doing so, thankfully. But I think that was a great moment of confirmation that, hey, you're not doing all wrong.
Well, thank you so much. That was an amazing presentation. And on behalf of the Los Angeles Center of Photography, thank you for being here today. Thank you, Laurent.